I got a call one day from our chief privacy officer. Now, at that point, when I got that call, I was thinking to myself, do I need to update my resume over here and start looking for jobs? Now, it's not a technology question anymore. The technology has, exponentially sort of surpassed our expectations. In my opinion, now it's a risk governance and adoption problem.
These AI models are as good as a junior doctor in terms of their knowledge level. What to think in terms of judgment?
Are we going to introduce bias into the system that negatively impacts disadvantaged members of our population?
Hello everyone, and thanks for listening to another episode of Data Innovators and Builders. Today I'm speaking with Asif Mujahid, Chief Data Officer in the healthcare and the health systems industry. Asif, thanks for chatting with me today.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure to be here, Saket. Thanks for having me on.
So Asif, you've had a very wide set of experiences. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into data.
Yeah, definitely, Saket. So, it's one of those things I'll say that when you're young and you're growing up and you're trying to figure out what to do with your life, you learn, you figure out what your interests are, and you figure out what your strengths are. And it's a great thing if those two align, your strengths and your interests align. And of course, if they don't align, then you figure out the Venn diagram of where they align and what you want to do with your life then. So I was fortunate enough to, I guess, figure out that some of my strengths, lied in the quantitative subjects, mathematics, data, etc., and I had a strong interest in those also. So then I said to myself, okay, knowing, why make life complex, let's just make a career in this domain. So went through my education, a background in economics and econometric modeling, and that's where sort of led to further interest in developing a career, in the quantitative sciences, etc. And then, once I graduated from college, went through different industries, aviation, finance, and then in the healthcare industry over the past few years here in the US, where it's been really a fascinating journey for me. Because at the end of the day, I think I'll speak for everybody in the world. It's a blanket statement. We all like to be data driven. We like facts to guide our decisions. And folks such as you and me, we in the analytics space, analytics practitioners, have a service to meet this expectation, to make things clear for our stakeholders. So that's been sort of my, main reason as to, the career I have right now. It's offering clarity, going through the data, offering clarity to folks so they can make more informed decisions. Family-wise, we have a couple of young kids. One is about to go to college, so that's a whole drama by itself. And then we have an 11-year-old who, she keeps us on our toes all the time. My wife's a physician, and as I always like to joke with folk who know me that I'm the one, doing all the simple stuff, building algorithms. She's the one actually dealing with lives. She's a physician, so she's doing the more important work in the household. But again, it's my pleasure to be here, Saket, and looking forward to a good conversation.
Yeah, that's an incredible background, Asif. And right before, as we were starting to talk about AI a little bit, especially how the impact will be and what impact might we assess, when we look at it in hindsight a few years from now, right? So maybe let's kick off right with that AI question, right? Let's talk about actually making real world AI impact with AI. Maybe not as much as a physician, but what sort of impact can it create? So let's chat a little bit about building these AI programs. So can you double click a little bit into that from your experience? Like where are you seeing the challenges in building real AI use cases?
Yeah, certainly could do that, Saket. I'll start with a statement that I think encapsulates a lot of what I'm seeing happening in the industry right now. I think over the course of the past couple of years, 2 to 3 years, OpenAI, etc., there's no magic over there. We've progressed a long way, when it comes to AI. And I think everybody aligns on the notion of that there's a big value opportunity over here with AI. I think we're at a crossroads where how do we get from that opportunity piece to value realization? And essentially, if I were a CFO, how do I see it in my books? This value that all we've been thinking about, articulating, expecting over the past few years, within the next 1 to 2 to 3 years, can I see it in the financials? And we're at that inflection point right now in terms of how do you go from A to B. And that to me is one of the biggest things that's happening, which people are trying to figure out, that how do you go from A to B? Because obviously now it's not a technology question anymore. The technology has, exponentially sort of surpassed our expectations. In my opinion, now it's a risk governance and adoption problem. And here's what I mean by that over here. Because now you're moving from the world of technology into the world of people and human behaviors. How am I, as say, as a non-AI individual, could use this black box of AI model information that is coming my way? And we've got to tackle that issue. Some of the tactical things, that a lot of folk have been thinking about, myself included, from a tactical standpoint, how do you solve for this, is that you address the trust question. Because keeping everything else aside, governance mechanisms, frameworks, which are extremely important, it comes back to trust at the end of the day. Well, I, as a non-AI practitioner, non-AI professional, have enough trust in this model or whatever it is that is coming my way to help me make more informed decisions. And in order to, sort of build that trust with your non-AI stakeholders, there's some fundamentals. There is an element around model transparency. Okay, if it's about that we're talking about that is part of this program, how can I offer transparency in very simple terms of what this model does, how it does it make life more simple, less difficult for the individuals who are going to use this model. The second is very important, data quality. And the principle, I guess, that I would use when addressing the data quality issue behind a successful AI program is, can I defend this in front of a regulator? Can I defend the data quality of this model? Does it meet the standard of a regulator? So can I put myself into the shoes of a regulator and convince the regulator that this is the data quality is good enough or meets that standard, for us to move forward. And the third piece, which is probably the most important piece, is the accountability piece. And that's a big gray area right now, that in the sense that you got a model, you got an AI program, who is it going to impact? What are they going to do differently? Who owns that decision to do things differently? Equally importantly, if things go wrong, what's the communication mechanism for that? What's the rectification mechanism if things go wrong? And for us to learn from that. So there's a whole sort of bolus, if I may, of work around accountabilities and responsibilities and defining those as part of an AI program. So to cut a long story short, to answer your, which is a really good one, Saket, is that there's a technology component to an AI program. I think that's mostly been resolved over here. But then there's a whole wrapper around trust, transparency, data quality, and accountability that needs to be built around there. And it's not anything new. People are thinking about it. But in my opinion, to go back to the original question, that takes us from value identification to the realization piece. Right? And that is one of the challenges I see, for all of us to overcome, to build that wrapper around the technology piece of a successful AI program.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely right, right? I mean, you are in a industry that is regulated. You're in an industry that has actually an impact on people's lives. So all the things that we did, even pre-AI, in terms of what are we building and what's the impact of that, what's the risk, you have to, as you said, defend in front of regulators as well. Um, when you look at like AI approaches, generative AI specifically, do you think it creates a unique challenge on that front in terms of the predictability of certain things is not the same, right? Um,
Yes, it does. So that's also a really good question, Saket. And there's a predictability piece, absolutely, which then gets into, how can you eliminate the black box piece of this, for our stakeholders, etc. But then there's a big governance piece on this also, because at the end of the day, I mean, there's the saying, it's on my saying, it's a saying that if there is something that can predict something, that doesn't necessarily mean we need to act on it right away. So how do you get from prediction to action over here, and what do we need to do to get from point A to point B? So let me actually share a story. There's a real life story. I won't mention the names over here, but this goes back 10, 12 years. And my team and I, we were building these predictive models. And I got a call one day from a chief privacy officer. Now, at that point, when I got that call, I was thinking to myself, do I need to update my resume over here and start looking for jobs, etc. So the point over here is that so I went over to the chief privacy officer's office, and their question essentially was, is that, with all this predictive modeling, it was not even this pre-AI, with all this predictive modeling that we're doing, are we going to introduce bias into the system that negatively impacts disadvantaged members of our population? And it's a great question. It's the right question to ask over here, and those are some of sort of the pitfalls, if I may, that we need to sort of consider and take into account. At times, I'm not saying this happens all the time, but at times we myself included, get so enamored, with the model, the technology, that we ignore that aspect of it, which essentially in this case, the chief privacy officer was bringing up was the customer experience, the consumer experience, the patient experience piece of it. So I know we weren't going to do this, but in case there's a scenario that you build this model, everybody is really excited, and you throw that model into production, and now it's negatively impacting, certain folk in the population. So how do you sort of account for that moving forward? So that's an example of a pitfall, I guess, that we need to sort of, that's less about governance, that's more about sort of the efficacy of the model. But those are some of the things, that if I'm a non-AI professional, I'm thinking about that, okay, these guys are sitting here doing all this stuff, building these models. I'm dealing with, sort of the patient over here. Will it eventually lead to a better patient experience? What you guys are doing. And I don't know, if I'm a physician, I'll channel my wife. I don't know the answer to that right now. Someone needs to convince me on that. So that's an example of things that we need to figure out, in my opinion.
No, no, that's a great point, and actually, it brings in a very important element that I think many AI leaders are looking at is the human in the loop in the whole process, and the diversity of opinion and perspectives that matter, right? So that's why in your story, like the chief privacy officer and the diversity of perspective that the person brings, because there's a mathematical optimization or a solution, but that's not a socially optimized or a business optimized outcome, right? So no, this is absolutely a critical point. In fact, this reminds me of certain stories that I've seen about how people started to use AI as a therapist, but then they realized that in cases it's actually giving the wrong sort of advice. It may look good on the very front of it, but then can push people to certain outcomes again, or certain actions that are actually negative in that way. And there are good examples where people have left AI systems entirely on their own to observe them and have seen behaviors that are self-preserving, right? So, but not in the overall interest. So it's a great point to bring up. Yeah. Um, Asif, let me switch to a little bit of the work that you have done within the healthcare industry. You've been at like companies like United Health Group and regional players like Quartz. Um, m- First, let me ask about specifically continuing on that AI question. We have seen coding as becoming one of the success stories of enterprise use of AI. I would say until coding came along, or AI coding came along, the big question was, okay, AI is cool, but what does an enterprise do with it? And software engineering became the first one. When you look at your experience in the insurance and the healthcare sector, what use cases do you see have been successful or might be the ones to look at?
Yeah. Yeah, good question, Saket. I'll make this very simple. I'll focus on healthcare because that's where I've spent, the past 10, 12 years. And I'll sort of put the whole healthcare model into three buckets, three places where value can be created through AI. And I'll explain just a bit in a bit what these mean. There's an administrative bucket, there's a supply chain bucket, and there's a care delivery, care optimization, care management bucket. So those are the three buckets where theoretically AI can create value. The administrative one is, just as its name suggests, a lot of administrative cost, because there's a lot of redundancy occurring from a process standpoint, very complex documentation in healthcare. And again, I'm not saying good or bad. because there is regulation. Obviously, you need to have policies and practices in place, but there's a fair amount of inefficiency that we create in the system, through this. So that is, at the end of the day, a good use case for AI, because in that, if you think about it, process efficiency, you're not really dealing with the patient experience. So that risk liability, goes away. You're dealing with really process related things. So that's where I've seen a lot of effort at this point concentrated in, and there's value over there, because, and it relates to margin leakage, or taking down your costs to maintain a program. Even if you can show, a small reduction in cost, it's a good thing, because then you can scale it. So there's a whole administrative cost bucket of where there's a lot of inefficiency, and AI is at the. I've seen use cases myself where AI is driving efficiency. The second is supply chain, which is the end to end. If you think about, the whole sort of model of healthcare, which, we probably need a few hours to discuss, but to make it, you got, drug manufacturers, you've got the dispensary, you've got the health system, you've got the health plan, you've got all these middlemen, so to speak, in the middle. So from a supply chain perspective, can AI come in and create a value over here? And there's an inefficiency component in all of this. The reason I drew out supply chain is because it's not purely process. There are entities involved. It's not the patients, but there are entities with their specific interests involved in that. That's why it's not the most easiest bucket. The easiest would be the admin one. Second would be supply chain, but there is an opportunity over there. The third piece where everybody, and this is the third, is the care management bucket. This is where everybody's excited, excuse me, about. And that's where your question with your point, which was a very good one and interesting one, came in, is that when you think about the care management piece, now it's about the patient, who we all want to do the right thing for. Yes, they have multiple different incentives, etc. But at the end of the day, if you assume that everybody is doing the right thing, everybody wants to do the right thing for the patient. Now, in that scenario, if you leave an AI model ungoverned, unfettered, you'd have no idea what that patient experience is going to look like. And in my discussions and my conversations, with folk across the spectrum, physicians, health system executives, I've been talking to folk in the private equity sector. There is always there is a feeling that, the biggest value is in this care management space. If we can somehow figure out, how do we get to a better patient experience, a better physician experience through applying AI, in its different forms, and that'll lead to something better. I'll give a quick example. This is actually a very probably tactical example. The other day, I went in for my annual checkup, and with my primary care physician, my dog. So, you were talking, and he mentioned to me he wanted to get an opt-in from me, and the opt-in was, this AI based, note taking system that they just started to use. And so obviously, I was like, okay, I can do some market research over here. So I asked my dog that what he thinks about it. He actually thought it was really good, really helpful, that we have this scribe, this AI scribe. It's a very early use case for, but in his opinion, it helped him, sort of, because in the old world, it was like he's talking to me, he's taking notes. He's talking to me, he's taking notes. But over here, his entire attention is now devoted to me. And he felt that it led to a better experience because he can listen to me more attentively, not worry about the note taking, which the AI scribe, is doing. So that's an example of where I guess on the face of it, it is in the care management space. You've created some value. It made for a better patient experience because I was talking to my doc without him being distracted over here. But to come back to your question, the bulk of the use cases that I see right now, Saket, are in the administrative space. There's some sort of going into the supply chain space. Care management, there are just a few use cases, but at least where the market thinking is, at least from what I understand, is the care management space is probably where we can create the greatest value for AI. So that gets me excited over here as to, how can we again, we all have to contend with, this notion of, we've been doing our best over the course of the past 10, 15 years. Costs for healthcare are still going up in spite of our best efforts. so can AI come in and offer us a solution of a better patient experience and also take down unnecessary costs in the health system. So that is the end of the rainbow, end of the road that we're looking at over here. And hopefully we can get to that point as we learn and mature in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, I love the framework that you've laid out here in terms of the administrative side, the supply chain, and the care side. And I think it's a great way to think about the risk and the impact and the value all like in a nice, clean way. So love the framework, and it's great that you bring up the cost of healthcare as well. I mean, this is it's a national challenge for us in the country, right? The healthcare cost challenge. And from when I talk to physicians and healthcare professionals in other countries, what I hear is that they have a different system. Those systems also have their own challenges, by the way. And but in many ways, when it comes to the quality of care, when it comes to complex scenarios of health situations, the United States is still considered like has some of the best care that you can get. The challenge is the cost of the care. And I agree with you entirely that if administrative side, for example, is entirely overhead, right? I mean, it's not leading to better outcomes, but there is a lot of administrative overhead, whether it's regulatory or whether it's the structural. We have a very different structure of how healthcare is managed and administered in the country, right? So it's a great opportunity to be more efficient and actually the ROI that a patient gets, the healthcare that they get and the cost that they have to pay for it, that equation hopefully improves significantly. So yeah, um, no, that's a very yeah. Yeah. No, that's a that's a very just cause because I mean, good healthcare is great, but if it's not affordable or people can't get it at all, then it's also pointless, at least for that individual, right? So there's definitely a worthy cause to focus on. Now, one thing that you mentioned in your example was your experience with a healthcare provider and how gathering data was in the way of your experience, and now with use of technology and AI, gathering data is out of the way. So it improves that care experience that you get. It perhaps is more time efficient also for the doctor because I hear from doctors that the amount of time that they have to spend in putting information in is you know is an overhead for them, and it's not where they get the job satisfaction, but it's a necessary part of it, right? So I want to bring a question on that front, in that since we've touched on data, maybe if you can share a little bit about your thoughts on data management in the space and how it's evolving. You've seen it in different scales, and one important element that I'm seeing is the ability with generative AI to take advantage of unstructured data. It's not just the call recording, but maybe it's the images or it's the free form notes along with structured data to quickly assess like what's going on and get that insight, right? So give us a bit of a picture into how data management, in your opinion, is evolving here.
Yeah, definitely. So there are two things I'll mention over here, Saket, is uh, when we think about data management and we use this term, data is messy. It's always been the case. We'll never get to play. Obviously, data is always changing, evolving, etc. I think so. The core data is messy was always there, irrespective of whether AI was in the mix or not. We had our data challenges, data issues. Um, what AI has done, directly or indirectly, good or bad, is thrown a spotlight on data. And AI is actually coming back to us and saying that, yeah, I'm the shiny kid on the block, AI, but really got to fix your data if you want AI to do a good job over here. So I do see a lot of organizations, as I look across healthcare, investing more so in data governance, platform, modernizing their data platform. In the old world, this was looked at as, a lot of technical debt, and companies were unsure if they want to invest in this right now because ROI is always challenging with, modernizing a data platform. But now, because we've got this sort of opportunity of value with AI, there is a fair amount of investment I see moving into the middleware, the data middleware, which is a good thing because that's something I know, I'm sure you agree with this, that for, we've been talking, screaming from the rooftops that, the predictive modeling, data science is all great, but there's a whole data layer that we need to sort of fix also. So that's the first thing, that there's a fair amount of investment in a good way that's coming into this, and companies are really thinking deeply and strongly about modernizing data platforms and especially data governance to support their AI programs. So that's one thing that's happening in this space. The second is, you brought up the example, which is actually, the one of the best use cases, that I see is, at point of conversation with the patient, how can you glean information that is not in your claims, not in your healthcare claims? Because we all know, I mean, healthcare claims is there's always a lag associated with that. The information that if somebody's looking at my claim information, that's from an event that happened like 30, 60, 90 days ago, that doesn't speak to something I'm going through in my life right now. So if at point of conversation and discussion, I as a physician or as a care provider can glean some new information from me about my health, that can lead to a better patient experience. So now the question is, it becomes sort of a model question in the sense that how do you tap into that new information that I, as a patient, am providing? That's the first part of it. The second part of it, how do we make sense of that new information that is coming in? Is it meaningful information for me? And number three is, if it's meaningful information, how do I act upon that information? We all need to make this work in real time. Now, I'll go back to a quick example. Again, this is dated, goes back to a few years. Is that pre-AI days, we would, in one of the organizations I worked, we were trying to do something similar over here. We didn't have the AI tools that we have today. So the use case was that patient calls into a call center, they're talking with a customer service agent or a clinician. And as part of that conversation, they may be offering new information that we do not have our hands on. So now the question is, can you use an API-based system to tap into that information, run it through a decisioning engine at the back end, and then provide updated information on the screen of the clinician who's talking to that patient? That may make it valuable to talk to that patient, at that point of discussion and conversation. So we were doing that a few years ago, I think. So that's where, I think AI has a big part to play to enhance and evolve that further, that use case further over here. Because again, I'll go back to one of the biggest challenges we have in healthcare when it comes to the patient experience is that in a lot of cases, we're talking to a patient about information that is 30 days old or 60 days old related to their health. And we leave it up to the patient to volunteer that new information. And if we don't have an AI solution, that is just information that gets lost. It's not being captured or saved anywhere. So there's a big use case in that, in terms of building a model around that and improving the patient experience. It goes back to something we talked about a few minutes ago around the care management space. How do you create value? And that's actually a very good use case, in my opinion, that where we can create value for both the patient and the physician who's delivering care to the patient.
Mhm. Yeah, I think one thing that I wonder about, especially as we hear that these AI models are as good as a junior doctor in terms of their knowledge level or whatever. I mean, I always wonder um, what to think in terms of judgment. Many of these decisions that doctors make are also judgment from years of experience. It's not simply translating and looking up certain symptoms or information. But I was curious that now that you have data in all of these different forms, of notes, recordings, reports, images, radiology and stuff like that, and you bring that together, because AI can this type of data was not queryable in many ways, right? And part of the data challenge, as we are saying, like it has always been messy, was because it was hard to tap into, and most of the systems we had were more structured and organized. If it's in a database that's cleanly organized and it's high data quality, then great, you can do stuff. But there is a new capability or new set of capabilities in being able to tap into that information. So I'm just curious in if you think that when it comes to the role of the data team and the AI team in sort of supporting that physician. You mentioned this, like make an API call and bring that information up. I mean, just what's your what do you see? I mean, being at the front lines, what is the vision that will happen hopefully in future when it comes to caregiving side of the role of data?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So here's what I'll say, Saket, on that. I'll go back to this old framework that we all have. It's the V's of data: volume, velocity, variety of data. I think with all this, with the technology that we had, say whatever 5, 10 years ago, we were at a certain state of volume, velocity, and variety of data that you could attach to a patient. And to your point, absolutely, AI has come and blown the top open on that, especially with generative AI, where now the sources of unstructured data that you can tap into are much more, which means now it impacts all three V's: the volume, variety, and velocity of data that you can attach to a single patient. So if you think about it very tactically or simply, you got a patient record and you got whatever, I'm making stuff up, you got 10 fields of data related to that patient. And those 10 fields of data are coming in on a weekly basis. And now you introduce Gen AI into the mix. Now you've got 25 fields of data coming in every day, for that patient. So that's the data piece of it, where now you've got a much richer, deeper source of, sort of sources of data that you can attach to the patient, and that's one of the big contributions of Gen AI in this field. The piece that is not missing, I think companies are working on this, and some may be more advanced than the others, is the decisioning piece on this, which you touched, the judgment piece that we've got data for me as a patient. Now, what do we do with this information? What algorithms, etc., do we need to run this through to come back with a different recommendation of how my treatment or care plan should look like as an individual? So the specific, I guess the very simplistic example would be, based on those 10 pieces of information, originally there's a certain care plan for me I have. Now we have 25 pieces of information coming in more frequently, and we pass that through a decision, some sort of decisioning engine. Does that change the care plan for me? And where I'm to, in all of this is, there's a key statement I'm getting to. Is it a different decision that the physician makes, in terms of the care plan with me? That is key over here, that decisioning. And that decision, and this is the last piece of it, which I wanted to bring up, that decisioning should not be based on only the collection of data or only the decisioning engine. It should be the collection of data, new data. It should be the decisioning engine, and it should be the judgment, that the physician makes. At the end of the day, in my opinion, the physician should be the judge, because they're the one who are interacting and dealing with me as a patient. And you do want that combination of their judgment, their intuition, their experience, complementing with all these data pieces and decisioning pieces that I talked about. That to me is, I guess, the framework through which we can, I guess, make some change or create some value. Going back to earlier discussion, how to go from value identification to realization. So if we can make that happen, and I know people are working on this, I haven't really seen any, I guess, standout solutions as yet, but it's good that people are thinking about that. But that would be one pathway to create some substantial value, through AI.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like one of the key sort of capabilities of people who are doing really well is to be entrepreneurial in their thought process and their execution, because you have the tools, you have the data and technology and just execution, and we see that pace at which new capabilities or products are coming out is very fast. So I want to actually double click a bit on your own entrepreneur experience. Tell us a little bit about that and how that has shaped some of the work or the thought process that you're bringing in.
Yeah, no, definitely, Saket. I'll do that. We all have an entrepreneurial bug in us. So I had that also at one time, and still ongoing, etc. The one thing I'll say is that, obviously I've, been fortunate enough to work for large organizations, smaller organizations, and then have a startup of my own. Though the two things that have been really different from my experience working across these different entities is speed and consequence. And here's what I mean. But and these may sound obvious, as I say these, is that in the startup environment, uh, you don't have strong consequences. You're focused on speed. You're focused on speed. You're focused on, failure, learning from failure, so that you can learn and get out a product to the marketplace that a market adopts. You're not as much concerned about consequence. Other end of the spectrum, if you're a large conglomerate, servicing millions of customers, there are many more consequences to failure. And even though this is I guess, a honest, transparent statement, we will all say that, we love to test and learn. We love to be a learning organization. We love to fail and fail fast. There are varying degrees of that, that state, whether you work in a startup or you work in a larger organization. And there's nothing wrong with that, because in a larger organization, there's much more to lose, by having unfettered, failure all the time, which in startups you can live with. So I totally understand that. So basically, the difference is, the learning, the pace at which you learn, the speed and the consequence, of excuse me, of that. So that, for me, the learning was, that okay, when you think about learning and failure and, being a learning organization, don't ignore the context of the organization that you're part of, in all of this, because there are certain degrees and levels of failure that an organization can tolerate, dependent on whether you're working for a startup or you're working for a large organization.
Yeah, I think this is very well put. In fact, I feel like we everybody in their work wants to create impact, right? In a startup, I think there's a little bit more freedom because, in terms of creating impact, because you haven't really found out what will create the impact, and your main job is to experiment and find that. In fact, not doing anything is the biggest failure. So it's better to do something, even when you don't know it will work or not, until you can find and iterate to get something that works. Right? So there's a reward to failing fast, right? But in an enterprise environment with real consequences, failure can have a significantly negative cost. Like, for example, in healthcare, right? There are many sort of such examples we can think of. Um, the mission, I think, still exists, is like people want to create an impact, but now you have to work within those sort of boundary lines. But yeah, figuring out how to still be able to experiment and find what can have an impact, but it has to go through more rigor, I would say, before you can just, put it out there and deploy it and start impacting, the lives of millions of people, right? So yeah, great
Yeah, yeah,
framework there.
that's
Yeah.
absolutely right, Saket. And one thing I'll also say over here is that, one of the interesting models, just to share, with people who may be listening to this podcast, is one of the interesting things I've seen some large organizations do is to create a company within a company, to make it happen. So yeah, while the overall organization, sort of sustains its model, maintains, its current processes, etc. You have a certain, sort of incubation arm within that organization that is doing that, and hopefully you try to achieve the best of both worlds, in this.
So in engineering, we call this a sandbox, right? So you've created a shell where you can do things, and the risk is not there. You're kind of in a safe environment. And tell us, I think this is great. Into the next point I want to talk to you about is building and structuring teams in today's organizations as a CDO, multiple functions, data engineering, analytics, AI, data science, all that stuff. So yeah, what would you say are the is the approach that you would recommend on that one?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say that, here's a so the first statement I guess I'll make is that, when you think about these components, data engineering, analytics, AI, in my opinion, in order for an AI program to succeed, ownership needs to be centralized and consolidated in one part of the organization. Could be a chief data officer, could be the chief technology officer, could be the chief financial officer. Neutrally, I don't care, but it has to be centralized, this, for that individual or that team to own it from end to end, the success of that AI program from end to end. Now, the reality is, if you're going to centralize, and this is gets into, if there's advice for new CDOs in the marketplace, is that to make sure that when you're centralizing, you're part of a centralized organization, there is organizational momentum behind that, and people are aligned, with that structure in an organization. excuse me, because the second part, the first we talked about the organizational structure, centralization. Second piece to this is where if you don't have it, it won't work. Is alignment with your partners and collaboration with your partners. So it's not only centralizing, because the last thing you'd want to do is centralize and go off, shut everything down, build an AI model, and then suddenly 6 months later, and say, surprise, we have an AI program now. So you've got to centralize, and then you've got to have a collaboration model with your stakeholders to keep them informed of what's going to happen, what's going to change, etc. What partnership you require from them. So those are the pieces that need to be put in the mix. There are two other things I may mention for a team to be successful over here. Is one is obviously for the folk on the team. I'll say this is that when you're in the analytics and data world, you can have a lot of information. The good, the bad, and the ugly of the organization you're part of, because you have all of their data. What that means is, my second point is that because you have access to all that data, there is a service that you owe to your stakeholders. Because from a stakeholder perspective, again, you want to be data driven. You want facts to inform your decisions. And I see this in organizations. There's a lot of frustration because you're not getting data or information in time to make those different decisions. So how can you sort of have that service leader, service model, delivery model aspect as part of your organizational structure? So not only centralize the organization, not only have a collaboration model, but have a very sort of co-developed, trusted service and delivery model that sort of lays out expectations with your stakeholders in terms of what's going to be output by when, what should the stakeholder expect, what do they need to change in their workflow or their decisioning as a result of stuff that's going to be output. So the key statement I'm getting to over here is that we've got to sort of move out of this world of delivering reports to sort of assisting or supporting a stakeholder in reaching an outcome. So how do we get to that point? And again, it's not a new or novel statement I'm making. It's just that we haven't been able to get to that second piece of it, and sort of AI is now sort of compelling all of us in the data and AI world to think differently. And that's the point I'm making, that as CDOs or as sort of data leaders, we need to think about the world differently. Where now it's less about building a report, delivering a report in the time you promised, which is a good thing to do, no doubt. But it's not only that, but it's being jointly responsible for the outcome that you and your non-analytic stakeholder are trying to make, for the end customer.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I 100% agree. And I think chief data officer as a role has been about business impact, actually, right? Because data, in my opinion, is just the means to the end. So, how are the decisions being made? And I think the evolution has been that, decisions were made by gut feel. And then, of course, now in the past 15, 20 years, there's been enough evolution that there's so much data that can be captured, that is being captured, that you can make very highly informed decisions. So, I mean, I want to bring that to the question of how the CDO role has also evolved, and maybe if you might have an opinion on that. Like, I feel like data engineering was being thought as more technical function, writing code and stuff, so it went into the more engineering CTO side of the org. But then data science itself is very rooted in statistical expertise, which is very different from writing code. Analytics is, again, is very close to business understanding, like what is happening in business, what matters, because you can look at thousands of charts. It doesn't gonna help you if you don't really have a good gut feel about what is business. And it could be the seasonality in my business, could be the customer behavior in my business, it could be all these structures of the business. And so it brings together a lot of different know-how, and then you add AI into the mix again. So are CDOs supposed to be like superheroes who know everything from engineering to AI to statistics to analytics, or how do you see that happen or evolve, right?
The answer is yes. So good. Apparently. No, yeah, it's a really good question, and it's um so here's my thought on this. The first thing I'll say is that, in my opinion, if I look at the expectations of the CDO role 10 years ago, expectation today, it has changed. It has changed quite a bit. The issue I have, and it's a pet peeve of mine, job descriptions are not changing to reflect that. And there's a bit of confusion in the marketplace, which is some of it you touched upon. What exactly should the CDO, I mean, the chief data officer, this the title itself, places them in a certain box, over here. So there's something around semantics and all of that stuff, that we need to figure out. But here's, to look at it more deeply, the chief data officer, plays certain archetypes, in an organization. There is, to your point, the technical archetype, technical capability, build a data platform. That's one. A second archetype could be a people leader, of your build a strong organization that is more business focused, as we said. The third is stakeholder manager, a good stakeholder manager over here, because at the end of the day, you brought the point up. I mean, data is a good thing, but data doesn't change the business. Decisions that you make with the data change the business. And it's not that the CDO is playing only one archetype; they're playing all of these at the same time. What has changed is the importance of these three, over the course of time. And for me, what I'm seeing is the importance around, owning joint outcomes with your business stakeholder. That is now sort of risen to the top, has become to the top of the mix. And here's what I mean by that. This is, from my personal experience also being in this space, is that our stakeholders, a lot of stakeholders that we have always anchor on the statement actionable insight, that, it's not really about the data, which is important. It's about an insight that is actionable. Uh, my pushback to that statement would be that it's a good statement to anchor on, but is that really the statement, or is a better statement that I need something that tells me whether I need to make a different decision with the problem I'm facing. That could be an actionable insight. It could be something else over here. So the point I'm making is that, are we asking the right problem? And my advice to CDOs would be, with your stakeholders, one scenario is that, you're sitting with your stakeholder, you're well intentioned, well meaning, want to understand their problem. They say actionable insight. You nod your head and you could try to figure out what that actually means. Oh, yeah. Another way to sort of interact with your stakeholders is that, let's not start with the phrase actionable insight. Let's start with the problem that you're trying to solve for. What is the actual problem? What is the different decision that you feel you need to make? And then we can decide, what exactly we need to build. So you work your way backwards from there. And that to me is the biggest thing, a biggest change I see, or biggest change that I think CDOs need to think about how they're going to do that, is to sit down with your stakeholders, figure out their business problem, what they're trying to solve for, tactically take it down to, instead of multiple use cases, take it down to one very important use case that you can deliver on within the next 90 days for your stakeholder. Have that discussion, come back to your team, and then figure out what you need to build. Is it, is it a dashboard? Is it a report? Is it a new model, etc.? You seem to be getting caught in this loop of, looking to your team, trying to build the technical capabilities, which is obviously you need to do. At the same time, trying to decipher, what your stakeholder wants, because your stakeholder is not speaking in the same currency or language that on the technical side you are. So in order to cut through all of that confusion, take some time out. My advice to CDO: sit down with your stakeholders, get down to that one use case, the next 90 days you can deliver on, top of mind for your stakeholder, deliver on that, and then sort of move forward, from there. It's easier said than done, I know, over here in organizations, but in my opinion, that's one thing that CDOs really need to sort of focus on moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's very well said. I feel like the concept of actionable insight is great one, but it sounds to me as a very narrow definition, which is just an antidote to maybe the analytics manager. Like if the CDO were a glorified analytics manager and all they were doing was throwing dashboards at people, then the question is like, hey, okay, there's a lot of dashboards, but what is the actionable insight is the question. But the role is much broader, in terms of the impact on business when you think about it from a strategy and impact perspective, whether it's in how you run your finance, how you run your marketing, how you understand your customers, how you even understand your own product, all of that stuff. And when you bring that all together, bring the AI delivery of AI capabilities into the mix, it's much broader than that. But I can understand why that term became important perhaps at some point. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's again, I've got nothing against the term. It's as a non-analytics individual stakeholder, you're missing something over here, and that's the term that you act on, hoping that people understand, what you mean by actionable insight. And that's where I would, sort of advise, if I may, the newer CDOs to spend some time, parsing down that actionable insight. Okay, what do we actually mean by this actionable? Can we tie it to a use case? What actually do we need to address this use case? We can call it actionable insight, whatever, but that's the level of detail you want to get to solve, the problem that your stakeholder is bringing to you.
Yeah, yeah. No, oh, look, technically, all work is about actions. We get paid for what we do, not what we just, maybe um, discuss or think over. But that's the part of the process to get into the action, right? So, but I think it's very clear that the ownership of data engineering and analytics and AI and being fragmented is not the solution. When there were different people owning it, it's complete chaos. You don't actually get to even the deliverable or business value. So it definitely comes together and yeah, raises the bar on the role and what you have to do. But as you said, align to the business, and sit down with what outcomes they are looking for, right? So yeah. Great. So I want to just ask this one last thing about some of the research work that you have done. Uh, you know, just curious if you can share a little bit about the academic research side of things, and it's how does that relate into the real world work, and the impact that you have been applying, right?
Yeah, no, definitely, Saket. I'm a big proponent of academia because a lot of ideas and the right solutions that today, fast forward, we've implemented in the real world, a lot of them have come from academia. You know, now the challenge is that when you bring something from academia into the real world, there is a strategic tension that happens because in academia, you're dealing with clean data, you're dealing with variables that you can control, you're dealing with sample populations that don't change over time. All of those are very different when you bring it to the real world where your populations are shifting, the makeup of your populations are shifting, you have operational constraints, etc. So the way that sort of we worked our research, in one of the prior organizations I worked with, is we looked at academia, looked at models, figured out that these models, that at this point are in the academic world, what problem do they address? Is that a problem that we are facing as a business? If yes, how can we go from point A to point B? Bring that academic model into the real world. So that's something that we use some academic models, brought them into the real world, operationalized those, and then sort of sort of shared that research with the world. And at the end of the day, the phrase I'll use is that academia or academic models offer us the right solution to a problem. When you bring it to the real world, you're figuring out the managerial solution. What you need, to make it actually work, in the real world. The point I'm making is that I wouldn't start from the real world solution because then you will be very constrained. You want to start off with the academic solution, which is the broad solution, and figure out, what you need to do to address real life constraints, address real life shifting populations to make it work in the real world. So that's some of the work that we did in the past, and we published our research. It was a very successful program, and that's why it gave me an even more greater appreciation for academia and what we can do, because there is still a lot of stuff untapped, in the academic world that we haven't brought to life in the real world. So there's an opportunity for us to do more stuff over there.
Yeah, I think it's very powerful and great work being able to take the time and effort to work on the academic research side of things as well, right? There's a lot of evolution in terms of the thought process that has to come, and much of that cannot be, say, applied in industry in a real world use case right away. But thinking about those frameworks and approaches is extremely important, right? So we'll, yeah, as we evolve and get there. So thank you so much, Asif. This has been extremely engaging conversation. I've really enjoyed learning from you in the process, and I think our audience was as well. Before we wrap up, if people want to follow your work, what's the best place for them to do that?
Just connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to have conversations. I'm always looking to talk to folk. I always joke, my work in the analytics world is boring. I always look to talk to folks. So anytime conversations. And I just want to thank you also, Saket, over here for the opportunity. Really enjoyed our discussion. Some great questions, that we asked. So hopefully this discussion is helpful for folk as they listen in.
Oh, I'm sure it will be, and I think that one of the things that I'm sure people want to follow is on LinkedIn is what you're working on, but if there is any place that you are also maybe um, point out as resources for people who want to learn the way you have been learning and sort of exploring, would love to maybe any books or any podcasts or any publications or tools that you might want to recommend.
Yeah, one that comes to mind immediately is Dan Ariely, economics at Duke University, behavioral economist. I won't say much. You just got to go and
Yeah.
listen to this. It'll change your life.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you so much, Asif. Great chatting with you.